Sing to me, oh Muse. The Odyssey, an original adaptation written and retold for you by Jon Buckeridge. Chapter 15. The Beggar. The great hall of Ithaca stood silent. It was just before dawn, and the servants had not yet arrived to begin preparing it for the feast of Apollo, so for now it lay vast, echoing, and filled with potential. Into that empty hall Odysseus stepped. He was dressed in his beggar's clothes, but with no one to see him, he stood at his ease. For 20 years he had thought of this hall, dreamed of being back in there, walking through it again. In this moment of calm before the storm that would surely follow, he took his chance. Everything was the same, but everything was different. Or maybe he was different. It was no longer the hall he had run in as a boy, carefree and full of hope. Now it was the hall he stood in as a man, cautious and full of memories. But still, the comforting shape of the hearth was the same as it had always been. The walls were covered in weapons and shields as they had always been. And there was the great throne of Ithaca he had sat in, and his father before him, as it had always been. Behind the throne, though, hung a great tapestry depicting his own face, or the face he had worn 20 years ago. That's new, he thought as he stared at it. He knew his own wife's work, and he smiled to see it now. A lot's changed since I looked like that, though, he thought. I hope the face I have today is one she can still love. A movement in one corner caught his eye. In a rough basket filled with coarse blankets, a blind old hound lifted up his nose and sniffed the air. It let out a small, tired bark and wagged its tail. Surely not, said Odysseus out loud. But it was his old dog, Argos. He had been just a puppy when Odysseus had left, and he'd had dreams of training him into a master hunter. But then everything had changed. He crossed to the corner and fell to his knees by the ancient dog, giving him the back of his hand to sniff. Good boy, he said. And Argos breathed in his scent deeply, his tail wagged again, and he gave Odysseus a friendly lick. Then he lay down, took a last deep breath, and was completely still. The old hound had waited for his master's return, and now, his job faithfully done, he took his rest at last. Good boy, Odysseus said again, and with a tear in his eye he picked up his old faithful friend and took him outside to bury. When he'd finished, dawn had broken, and the hall was starting to see movement. Odysseus adopted the cracked voice and arched back of the beggar and faded into the background. Rushing about their business, no one gave him a moment of attention as he sat calmly, waiting and watching. Telemachus, though, coming down from his room, saw Odysseus immediately. He rushed over to him, speaking in a low voice. Father, he said, welcome back to your hall. Today we shall reclaim it for you. He spoke with the voice of idealistic youth, one that still believed the songs that spoke of battle as glorious and noble instead of bloody and brutal. I remember being like that, thought Odysseus. But to Telemachus he said, I'm glad to have you by my side to do it. Your mother suspects nothing? I haven't told her of your return, no, he confirmed. Good, said Odysseus. No one can know I'm back yet. After 4 years of waiting for their chance at the throne, the suitors would not take news of his return well, and they could have a full-scale rebellion on their hands. We need to box clever and make a move that ends the fight before they even see it coming. Do you trust me? Telemachus nodded. Then you know what to do. Yesterday, Odysseus, Telemachus, and Eumaeus had stayed up long into the night making their plans, and now Telemachus hurried to take all the weapons off the wall of the great hall and lock them safely away in a storeroom. Let's not give them the tools to fight back, Odysseus thought. At that moment, the huge shape of Eumaeus strode into sight, with Philoetius, the faithful herdsman, by his side. A small nod was all the signal Odysseus needed to know that they knew their role in the plan. The hall was fully alive now, with servants and slaves bustling about all over the place, getting it ready for the feast of Apollo. I wonder which of you are loyal to me, Odysseus thought, as he watched them hustling to and fro, and which of you have been helping the suitors all these years, plotting and planning against my wife and son. Shrinking back into a corner, Odysseus sat and observed. Antinous walked up to the palace of Ithaca as a guest for, hopefully, the final time. By the end of the day, the place will be mine, he thought, looking it over. He walked through the great doors to the feasting hall and stared around, taking a deep breath of satisfaction. All mine, he told himself. He stroked a perfect hair behind a perfect ear and looked around the room. He would have to make some changes, of course. That tapestry of Odysseus's face could go for a start. As he mentally rearranged the room, he noticed that in one corner there was a shabby tramp huddled over. Why do these people always have to ruin places like this, he thought. You there, he called at the beggar. Who told you you could be in here? Get out! The tramp gave no answer. The nerve, thought Antinous. I said get out, you idle scrounger. Scrounger, you say? Crooned the broken old figure. Oh gods, thought Antinous, he sounds like a rusty hinge. I'm a man down on my luck looking for charity. Whereas you, my noble lord, why, I'm sure you pay for every penny of generosity this house gives you, don't you? Antinous was flabbergasted. Had this beggar just mocked him? Why, you! He couldn't even think of a word, he was so angry. Reaching down, he picked up a nearby footstool and hurled it with all his might at the tramp. He'd thrown it hard. He knew he'd thrown it hard. Whatever else he was, Antinous was not weak. And the stool crashed into the man's shoulder, smashing to pieces. But the beggar didn't so much as flinch. He took a hard look at Antinous, glanced down at his shoulder where the stool had struck him, and brushed a speck of dust away from his ragged clothes. Penelope was in her chambers above the great hall, mentally preparing for the day ahead. This is it, she told herself. Stay strong. You're doing this for Telemachus. You have to keep him safe. Suddenly, a shouting and crashing noise from the hall below clawed their way into her thoughts. Rushing to her balcony, she saw Antinous staring daggers at an old beggar sitting in the corner. The servants had stopped their work, staring, and there were the remains of a footstool scattered on the floor around the older man. Antinous, she cried from her balcony. How dare you treat a visitor to this household in that way? She flew down the stairs and barely remembered to straighten her spine and set her shoulders before she walked out. Don't go to war without your armour. Stepping out, she addressed the lantern-jawed suitor. This household has a long tradition of kindness and generosity to those in need, and while you are a guest under this roof, I will not have you disrespect that. Do you understand? Antinous's eyes were smarting with ill-concealed malice, but he turned to the beggar and bowed. My apologies, sir. I misspoke. He turned back to Penelope, and she saw the malice in his eyes was gone, and had been replaced by that cold calculation she had always been much more afraid of. Careful, my lady, the man said. After today, I may not be a guest here much longer, and who knows what traditions may change after that. He turned on his heel and stalked away. Hateful man, Penelope thought, and she took a shaking breath and composed herself again, turning to the beggar. I apologize, sir. That is not the welcome you should have received in the hall of Odysseus. Let me send for some food and drink for you, and I shall send my maid to wash the dirt from your fee. She trailed off. The old man was staring at her, mouth open, and for some reason tears were welling up in his eyes she thought she knew. Are you all right, sir? She asked him. Antinous has not harmed you, has he? The beggar looked away hurriedly, blinking, and spoke in a hoarse voice. No, my lady. You are most kind. Thank you for your generosity. Penelope nodded and left. Watching her go, Odysseus felt short of breath. For 20 years he'd remembered her, imagined her, been desperate to get back to her, and a small part of his mind had always thought, you're building her up too much, she can't possibly live up to these expectations. But seeing her there, outraged by injustice and fighting to show kindness to a stranger, I'll have to raise my expectations to even get close to her level, he thought. Eurycleia bustled through the hall, carrying an armload of towels and a basin of water. Honestly, she thought, what is my mistress thinking, sending me to do such work when she clearly needs me today? But then we must be kind to those in need, even when it's not convenient. She felt her knees creak as she knelt in front of the old man and began washing his feet. We'll soon have the dust of the road gone from you, sir, she told the beggar. Thank you, the man replied. You are most kind. Oh, thank my mistress, said Eurycleia. 'Tis her that's kept the generosity of this household alive, even in hard times and difficult circumstances. She fell into a familiar pattern, humming a gentle tune to herself and washing the beggar's feet in time to it. She'd done this so many times to so many different people that her hands were operating entirely without her brain's involvement. But then she moved to the man's calf, and she gasped. Staring, she saw a scar on the man's leg that she thought she knew. No, she knew it. That was the scar Odysseus had got when he was hunting wild boar as a child. She'd washed that same leg with that same scar for almost 10 years, and though it had been a long time since she last saw it, she would never forget it. Her eyes darted from the scar to the man's eyes, those familiar, twinkling eyes looking down at her. "Hello, Nanny," said the beggar in Odysseus's voice, and Euryclea could swear her heart skipped several beats. "Odysseus!" she gasped, but Odysseus had his hand over her mouth in an instant. Glancing hurriedly round the room, he came close to her and whispered, "No one can know it's me, Nanny. I mean, no one. Do you understand?" Euryclea nodded, and he went on. "Today we reclaim my home, and I'll need your help. When everything kicks off, you'll know the moment. I need you to get the servants and slaves out of the room and lock the doors behind you. Make sure everyone is safe. Do you understand?" Euryclea nodded again, and Odysseus removed his hand. "It's good to see you, Nanny," he said. "I've missed you." "I've missed you too," Euryclea replied, "and I'm so pleased you're finally home. Lady Penelope will be ecstatic." "Not a word to her, Nanny," Odysseus warned. "I don't want to put her in danger a moment longer than I have to." "Danger is something of a way of life for her, my lord," the woman replied. "But to take your meaning, I shan't say a word." Collecting up her towels, she hurried off, leaving Odysseus alone. That was it. The board was set, and all he could do was wait for the feast to begin and the other players to arrive. "Athena, give me strength," he prayed silently. And despite the daylight, from outside he heard an owl hoot, and he smiled.